You were taught to believe that your thoughts are yours, that your choices are yours, that who you are, your personality, your fears, your reactions, your desires are all the results of your own mind, free and untouched. You were not told that everything you call yourself was in fact carefully shaped by forces that never asked for your permission. Dark psychology does not knock on your door, it builds the door, the room, the entire house, where your mind is supposed to live. The colors you like, the words you use, the people you admire, the values you fight for, most of them were never born inside you. They are placed, installed through repetition, praise, fear, and silence. Think about this: if a machine were programmed to think it is not a machine, how would it ever escape the illusion? That is exactly what happens when dark psychology embeds itself into your core through psychological manipulation. Not the kind you read about in criminal reports or spy novels, but the kind that feels warm, subtle, familiar. The kind you meet at dinner, in classrooms, in lullabies. The kind that lives in compliments. The kind that lives in expectations. When you were praised for being a good child, what did you learn to silence inside yourself? When someone told you people do not like it when you act that way, did you stop because it was wrong, or because it was punished? You think you know who you are, but the question you never asked is, who taught you what you even means? The most dangerous manipulators are not villains behind closed doors. They are systems, rituals, family dynamics, and culture. They work best when they stay invisible, because when you cannot see the strings, you think you are dancing on your own. Here is a difficult question that psychology rarely dares to ask in plain daylight. What if your identity, your preferences, your life roles were never a result of your freedom, but a product of childhood conditioning, sustained by emotional control? In behavioral psychology, there is no self without environment. Even Pavlov did not teach dogs to salivate. He taught science that the mind is programmable. B.F. Skinner proved that behavior is not chosen, it is reinforced. These were not experiments on dogs or pigeons. These were instructions about you. And yet society wraps these truths in elegant lies. That your success is your own, that your failures define your worth, that your dreams are unique. In truth, you were conditioned to pursue what is allowed, avoid what is punished, and call the result yourself. That is why dark psychology is not an external threat. It is an internal system, operating without detection, a parasite that becomes the host, a blueprint that convinces you it is your skin. There is a reason Jungian psychology speaks of the shadow self. Carl Jung warned that the parts of you that were denied, suppressed, or feared did not vanish. They became silent architects of your behavior. And what if those shadows were not born in you, but fed into you by those who needed you silent, compliant, and predictable? Why does a child stop asking dangerous questions? Why does a teenager conform to absurd norms? Why does an adult defend the very structure that drained their vitality? The deeper question is this: if you were trained to believe you are free, how would you recognize the cage? And now, here is the unsettling truth. Someone, somewhere, decided long ago who you were allowed to become, and you may still be playing by those rules without knowing it. But we are not done yet. In this journey, we will take a look at one of the most seductive lies that has shaped your life, an idea so widely accepted most never question it. We will then begin to uncover the truth behind that lie, using what dark psychology does not want you to see. So stay exactly where you are, because this is only the surface, and what lies beneath will question everything you believe about who you are. You have probably believed this one idea your entire life, that you are the author of your identity, that your personality was something you shaped, one decision at a time, that your thoughts reflect your core, and your actions prove your character. It feels empowering to think that way. It gives life meaning, dignity, and structure. But that belief is a construction, a polished illusion. The idea that you are who you choose to be is not only false, it is the most efficient form of psychological control ever invented. Because once someone believes they are in charge, they stop looking for who is behind the curtain. Think back to your earliest memories of approval, the moments where someone smiled when you did something right. Now think about the silence, the disapproval, the withdrawal when you did something wrong. What happened in those moments was not love, it was programming. Little rewards for being manageable, quiet punishments for deviation. Over time, those lessons buried themselves into your nervous system, into your breath, into your instinct. The reward was not just praise, it was belonging. And you, like all of us, needed to belong far more than you needed to be authentic. That is where identity began to rot. From the outside, it looks like personality. From the inside, it feels like choice. But in truth, it is the product of repetition, reinforced behaviors, not free will. You started reacting, adapting, bending, until the reactions became habits, and the habits became you. Now imagine a society built on that process, multiplied across millions of people, a culture that rewards obedience, disguised as individuality, a world where being unique is only acceptable if it fits inside a box someone else built. And this is not some abstract dystopia, this is modern reality. It is in schools that punish curiosity, in families that label silence as respect, in workplaces that reward submission and call it professionalism. You are not who you think you are who you were told to be, filtered through layers of survival, shame and strategy. Even your rebellion, at times, was pre-approved. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre warned that freedom is terrifying, that most people would rather be controlled than risk the anxiety of true choice. That is why so many cling to structure, tradition, identity labels, because behind those walls, the chaos of the unknown is kept at bay. The paradox is brutal. The more you identify with your label, the less of yourself you actually own. That is how psychological manipulation operates at the root level, not by forcing you into submission, but by seducing you into accepting a lie as truth. If it whispers the lie early enough, gently enough, you will repeat it to yourself for decades without knowing where it came from. Some people wonder why anxiety and identity crises are spreading faster than ever, but it makes perfect sense. When the system that built your identity starts to collapse, your mind has no idea what to fall back on. You begin to feel unstable, disconnected. You do not know what is real, what matters, or who you are. But that confusion is not failure. It is evidence that the script is breaking. Now pause, look at your habits, your rituals, your deepest beliefs. Ask yourself which ones you actually chose, not agreed with, not adopted, chose, from awareness, not survival. Because somewhere in that list, you will find truths you inherited without a vote. You will see how dark psychology planted seeds not to harm you, but to shape you into something useful, predictable, controllable, and most of all, unaware. If that thought unsettles you, it should. It means something inside you is waking up. Write in the comments what part of your identity you now question the most. What did you believe about yourself that suddenly feels artificial? Let others see it. Let yourself say it. Because awareness is not healing, but it is the first betrayal of the lie. Not everything inside you belongs to you. And what comes next will begin pulling at those threads you thought were permanent. Keep going. Long before you understood the meaning of rules, you were already following them. Before you had the language to express what you felt, you were learning which expressions were allowed, and which would be met with discomfort, withdrawal, or punishment. This is where identity begins, not with discovery but with training. In the early 1900s, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov conducted experiments that proved something both simple and disturbing. Behavior can be conditioned. When a dog hears a bell and receives food, it starts salivating at the sound alone. That mechanism is not limited to animals. Humans, even with all their complexity, are just as responsive to repetition and reward. In fact, the brain is built to find patterns and attach meaning to stimuli. The more consistent the feedback, the more ingrained the behavior becomes. Bauhaus Frederick Skinner expanded on this, demonstrating that not only can behaviors be reinforced or diminished, but that the individual often does not realize it is happening. Over time, choices are no longer based on thought, but on a history of reward or punishment. The illusion of autonomy survives only because the mechanism is invisible. This matters because you were not raised in a vacuum. You were trained to respond. Parents, teachers, peers, they all used versions of conditioning. A raised voice, a disappointed look, a small smile when you obeyed, a cold silence when you did not. You were not learning who you were learning what made others comfortable. It begins early. A child who is quiet and compliant is told they are good. A child who questions or disrupts is labeled difficult. These labels are not objective descriptions. They are signals. Be this, not that. Over time, the child absorbs them. The reward is affection. The punishment is distance. Now scale that process into society. Think of how school systems are structured. Timed bells, standard tests, fixed roles. Think of how the workplace mirrors those early years. Expected behavior is incentivized. Deviation is penalized. Compliance is not requested. It is expected and often demanded. Those who comply are rewarded with stability. Those who resist are punished with isolation, disapproval, or economic consequence. That is not education. That is programming. When compliance becomes habitual, it no longer feels like submission. It feels like personality. A person begins to say, "This is just who I am," without realizing they are describing a long chain of reinforced responses. If every time you expressed anger you were shamed, and every time you smiled you were praised, eventually your body stops even considering the full range of response. You learn to be likable, not honest. The tragedy is that this often looks like success. Someone who has mastered the expected behaviors is praised, promoted, admired. But behind the curtain, they are still responding to bells, still chasing treats, still waiting for the next signal that tells them who they are allowed to be. This is not just psychological theory. It is visible in real life, every day. People who stay in careers they hate because they fear disapproval. People who laugh at jokes they do not find funny to avoid discomfort. People who accept roles in relationships that diminish them because conflict feels more dangerous than invisibility. The mind adapts to survive. It bends under pressure. It hides its real impulses to maintain approval. Eventually, the real self becomes foreign, even frightening. Ask yourself, how many of your daily actions are driven by choice? And how many are rituals you never questioned? How many of your beliefs would survive if you could not be rewarded for them? There is a type of freedom that feels terrifying at first. The kind that comes not from rebellion, but from clarity. The realization that compliance was never harmless. It was never neutral. It was shaping you, reinforcing you, directing you, not through violence, but through predictability. And the longer you obeyed, the more normal it became. But what if some of your strongest habits are simply the most successful results of early conditioning? What if the person you think you are is just the version that survived? That question stays open, because what you are about to see is not just about obedience. It is about how your environment did not just train your reactions, but rewrote your values. There is a specific kind of manipulation that never uses threats, never raises its voice, and never forces you to obey. It only needs you to believe that the majority is right, that authority knows better, that to disagree is to isolate yourself. This is the form of influence that molds entire societies without a single drop of visible pressure. In the 1950s, Solomon Eliot Ash conducted a now famous conformity experiment. Participants were placed in a group and asked to match line lengths on cards. The task was simple, the correct answer obvious, but when actors in the group deliberately gave wrong answers, the real participants conformed, choosing the wrong answer over what they could clearly see with their own eyes. Even when the truth was visible, the fear of being different overpowered logic. A few years later, Stanley Milgram took it further. In his obedience experiments at Yale University, participants were instructed to deliver what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person. Many obeyed, even as the supposed victim screamed. Why? Because an authoritative figure in a lab coat told them to continue. These were not cruel people. They were ordinary, and they obeyed not out of malice, but out of conditioning. This is how invisible influence works. It does not need chains when it can train you to feel guilt for disobedience. It does not need violence when it can dress power in politeness and a clipboard. The most effective control systems are not those that attack your freedom directly, but those that convince you you are free. In everyday life, this takes quieter forms. You adjust your tone when speaking to authority. You hesitate before expressing disagreement in public. You filter yourself before sharing an unpopular opinion. You might call it manners or respect, but deep inside, it often comes from fear of exclusion or judgment. Think about how identity forms in this climate. You are not only responding to direct feedback, but also to what is socially rewarded. You learn what to say to avoid conflict, what opinions to hide to keep peace, which parts of yourself to suppress because they are not appropriate. Over time, that suppression becomes internalized. It no longer feels like performance, it feels like character. Even praise can be a form of manipulation. When a child is praised for being obedient, they may never learn to think critically. When an employee is rewarded for never speaking up, they stop offering ideas. What is rewarded is repeated. What is repeated becomes identity, and no one questions identity because it feels personal. The influence goes deeper than rules or etiquette. It is embedded in the stories society tells, in television shows where the rebellious character is always punished, in news cycles that portray deviation as danger, in corporate structures that pretend to celebrate diversity but reward sameness at every level. You live inside a script, and it was written to keep everything predictable. Manipulators do not always look like villains. Sometimes they are institutions. Sometimes they are traditions. Sometimes they are the voices inside you that were never yours to begin with. You believe you are making your own decisions, but those decisions are often drawn from options pre-approved by your environment. There is a strange discomfort that comes when you start noticing this, a kind of psychological vertigo. Because if the influences are invisible, then how do you know which thoughts are truly yours? How do you separate your voice from the echo of everyone else's expectations? This question does not go away easily, and it gets even harder when you begin to realize that some of the values you defend are not built on truth, but on your need to belong. That belonging, for many, becomes more important than clarity. The approval of a group outweighs the discomfort of being right alone. Now ask yourself, if everything around you rewarded your compliance and punished your resistance, how would you know what your actual values are? That is not a simple question, and it only leads deeper, because the next layer is not just about how you were influenced, but how pain and trauma were used to make sure you never challenged those influences again. You did not become who you are, only through reward and imitation. You became this version of yourself through pain, structured, repeated, and internalized pain. Emotional wounds do not just scar, they instruct. They guide behavior, form beliefs, and carve deep trenches into the identity you think you chose. Pain becomes instruction when it is consistent enough. That is how trauma creates personality. Early in life, experiences of rejection, humiliation, fear, or abandonment leave a mark. But the most damaging effect is not the memory, it is the adaptation. When a child learns that crying leads to withdrawal, they stop expressing sadness. When speaking up leads to punishment, they learn to stay silent. Those responses, repeated over time, harden into patterns. You grow up not remembering why you act a certain way. You just feel like that is who you are. This is what Carl Gustav Jung meant when he described the shadow self. The parts of the psyche that were rejected, punished, or feared become buried, but they do not disappear. They live beneath the surface, influencing thoughts and choices in silence. If your fear of confrontation was born from repeated emotional backlash, it will become part of your identity, not because it belongs there, but because it protected you once. Trauma shapes you through avoidance. The parts of yourself that you hide, mute, or overcompensate for are often connected to early pain. If affection was given conditionally, you may now overachieve to feel worthy. If love was withheld, you may chase approval in every interaction. These patterns do not feel foreign. They feel like instinct, but they are not instinct. They are responses to unresolved emotional harm. And then comes the most dangerous aspect of trauma, repetition. Without awareness, your mind will seek out similar environments to recreate the original wound. This is not self-sabotage. It is an unconscious attempt to master the original experience, to gain control over what once felt powerless. But it rarely brings healing. Instead, it reinforces the damage. A person abandoned as a child may unconsciously enter relationships where neglect feels familiar. Someone shamed for anger may be drawn to people who provoke it, just to keep suppressing it again. Emotional control does not always look like violence. Often it looks like shame. A parent says, "You are too sensitive," and a child stops trusting their feelings. A teacher humiliates a question, and a student stops being curious. These are not isolated events. They are emotional programming cues. They teach which parts of the self are acceptable and which are liabilities. Over time, this training builds a version of you that is socially acceptable but emotionally disfigured. You learn to function while feeling disconnected from your own needs. You learn to perform stability while hiding deep emotional tension. And because so many people live this way, it feels normal. In mental health psychology, this is often seen in clients with complex trauma, or what is now recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. These individuals do not always recall specific events. Instead, they report patterns, always feeling on edge, always pleasing others, never feeling fully alive. The trauma is not always what happened, but what kept happening, quietly. Trauma teaches you to protect yourself, not to know yourself. And protection, when left unchecked, becomes identity. You start defining yourself by your defense mechanisms. I am just a loner, or I am just anxious, or I do not trust easily. These are not personality traits. They are the emotional strategies of someone who had to survive something. If someone asked you which parts of your personality formed after pain, would you be able to answer? Would you be able to separate the parts that came from clarity from the ones that came from defense? There is a hidden cost in carrying trauma silently. Not just suffering, but distortion. Your view of the world shifts, your view of others twists, and your view of yourself narrows. You stop seeing possibilities and start living in patterns. This is why emotional control is one of the most powerful forms of dark psychology, because once a person internalizes the pain, they begin to police themselves. No chains, no threats, just quiet, unrelenting self-censorship. And yet, the origin of that censorship was never questioned. You never asked where the silence came from. You just obeyed it. But there is still one layer deeper. The influences that taught you who to be were not always random. Some were designed. Some were structured to shape not just your choices, but your values, loyalties, and entire worldview. And those architects may not have had your well-being in mind. Most people live with the sense that their thoughts, values, and beliefs formed naturally over time, like a garden shaped by the weather. But gardens are often designed, pruned, and managed by someone. Your mind was not left to grow wild. It was cultivated by people, systems, and institutions with their own interests in mind. There are architects behind how you were shaped, and they rarely appear suspicious. They do not wear masks or speak in threats. They create school curriculums. They write advertisements. They build entertainment. They decide which facts are taught, which truths are avoided, and which behaviors are rewarded. And they operate quietly, under the belief that what they are doing is normal, necessary, or even good. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, applied principles of psychoanalysis, not for healing, but for control. In the early 20th century, he developed modern public relations, manipulating desires by attaching emotions to products, politics, and ideologies. His work helped corporations and governments engineer consent. People were no longer persuaded through information. They were trained through emotion. The message was simple: make them feel, not think. That strategy is now a cornerstone of every major system that seeks control. Advertisers sell identity, not products. Politicians sell fear, not policy. Social media platforms sell validation, not truth. These systems do not need to oppress you directly. They simply need to offer you the version of yourself that fits best into their framework. The media tells you what is relevant. Religion tells you what is sacred. Education tells you what is true. Government tells you what is right. Each system offers a set of values that, over time, begin to feel like common sense. But common sense is not always truth. It is often the residue of repeated exposure. Ask yourself, why do you trust some institutions without question? Why do certain narratives feel more comfortable than others? Why do you feel anxiety when questioning what everyone else seems to accept? Those feelings are not random. They were installed. When you are trained to believe that questioning equals rebellion and rebellion equals danger, you no longer need to be told what to believe. You do it automatically. The architects no longer have to intervene. You guard the door yourself. Consider how this affects morality. You are told what is good and bad by the culture you grew up in. But those labels shift depending on who is in power. A behavior considered virtuous in one era becomes immoral in another. That should raise a serious concern. If your ethics were handed to you, how do you know they are your own? Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche warned of herd morality, the idea that most people adopt values not because they have examined them, but because they are socially enforced. They conform not from reflection, but from fear of exclusion. The result is a population that believes they are free thinkers, while recycling the thoughts handed to them by others. This is not an accusation, it is a reality of human psychology. People are shaped by repetition, reinforced by approval, and bound by emotion. What makes it dangerous is the absence of awareness. Once you believe your programming is your personality, change feels like betrayal. This is how entire belief systems are passed through generations without question. Children grow up absorbing the ideologies of their environment, believing them to be facts. Loyalty becomes virtue, doubt becomes sin, questioning becomes rebellion. And it works. Because what matters most to many people is not truth, but identity. And when the architects of society understand that, they stop trying to persuade you and start trying to define you. You might have believed your values were formed from experience, but many of them were pre-installed, embedded in everything you consumed before you were old enough to ask why. Look at your views on success, on failure, on gender, on relationships, on work, on self-worth. Ask yourself who benefits from you holding those beliefs, who profits when you behave the way you do, who loses if you wake up. That is not paranoia, that is critical awareness. And it leads to an uncomfortable moment, the realization that your values, preferences, and loyalties may not be yours, not because you were lied to directly, but because you were never given a real choice. But once you see that, a new kind of choice emerges, one that starts not with action, but with the dismantling of everything you assumed was true. And now that choice is staring at you. Because what happens when the story you have told yourself about who you are begins to collapse, and all that is left is silence? What if you were never supposed to know who you are? Not because it is unknowable, but because it is dangerous. Dangerous to systems that depend on your compliance. Dangerous to those who thrive when you doubt your own instincts. Because the moment you begin to see clearly, everything that was built around your confusion starts to crack. This is where the surface ends, and what lies beneath is not comfortable, it is not dramatic, it is quiet, unsettling, and slow, but it is real. So here is the part you were not told. Dark psychology is not only about others controlling you, it is about how you absorbed that control so deeply that now you maintain it yourself. You do not need someone telling you what to do anymore. The voices are already inside. You avoid risk, not because you lack courage, but because failure was once weaponized against you. You second-guess your feelings, not because they are wrong, but because they were once dismissed. You follow norms not because they make sense, but because standing out once meant emotional exile. What you call personality may still be a map of avoidance. That realization is not shameful, it is expected. The human mind prioritizes survival before truth. And survival often means adapting to whatever environment gives you safety. Whether that environment is loving or abusive does not matter at the level of psychology. What matters is predictability, and predictable pain feels safer than unknown freedom. But this brings us to a question you cannot escape now. If you were shaped by forces that never asked for your permission, what does it mean to reclaim that permission now? There is no clean answer. There is no switch to flip, but there is a mirror. You may have lived your whole life looking outward, seeking validation, avoiding judgment, chasing identity. But now you are being asked to look inward, without the scripts, without the labels, without the voices that are not yours. The image you see might be unfamiliar at first. That is because you are seeing someone who has been buried under years of adaptation, under systems that encouraged silence, under people who only accepted you in fragments. You may ask, if this is all programming, then who am I without it? That is the right question, not for an answer, but for awareness. Because the truth is not something I can give you. It is something only you can begin to sense when the noise begins to fade. Carl Gustav Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is your invitation to do exactly that. To look at the beliefs you defend, the habits you cannot explain, the people you attract, and the things you fear, and ask where they really came from, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a personal excavation. If you have reached this point, write down what you have discovered about yourself so far. What thought did you once believe was yours that no longer feels authentic? What part of your identity now feels like a costume? Write it, for yourself, for someone else who may need to see it. Because truth spreads best when spoken quietly. And here is what makes it even more difficult. Even when you start to see clearly, the systems that shaped you will not disappear. They will still be there, offering the same roles, demanding the same compliance. But now, the difference is that you will know. And with that knowledge comes something unusual. Not peace, not yet, but power. Power to pause before you respond. Power to feel discomfort without obeying it. Power to separate your authentic voice from the ones you were trained to echo. You were built to be something useful to others. Now you must decide whether usefulness is still your priority. But the next move is not external. It is not a rebellion or a performance. It is internal, quiet, unseen, and it begins where you stop pretending to be who you were never meant to be. Keep that thought alive. Because this reflection you are now facing, this mirror, it is the one thing the architects hoped you would never find. There is a moment, subtle and quiet, when realization stops feeling like shock and starts feeling like responsibility. It is when you recognize that who you are is not a solid truth, but a fluid arrangement. And that arrangement was shaped, distorted, colored, and framed by forces that had no obligation to tell you the truth. Everything up until now was meant to keep you within the lines. You were trained to believe your reactions were natural, your dreams were personal, your limits were real. But behind all of that was a framework, designed, maintained, inherited, a legacy of influence, so deep that you stopped questioning it, simply because everyone else accepted it too. Now that you have seen behind the surface, the question is not whether you can go back, because you cannot. The real question is whether you are willing to stop looking away. You will still wake up in a world that wants you silent. You will still encounter systems that offer comfort in exchange for obedience. You will still be surrounded by people who are playing roles, believing they are being themselves, and none of that will change just because you see it now. But what does change is you. Not with noise or protest, but with awareness. The awareness that what you thought was a choice might have been programming, that your idea of love, success, respect, even goodness was someone else's idea, installed early, repeated often, and made to feel like your own. And once you know that, you are not who you were. Dark psychology made you who you are without asking. That is true, but now you know. Now you can ask yourself the question they hoped you would never think to ask. Who would I have been without the interference? Maybe you will never fully know. Maybe the original version of you was lost too early, before it had a chance to take shape. Or maybe it is still buried beneath the behaviors, the roles, the expectations, waiting for permission to return. That permission will not come from others. It cannot. It must come from you. The path forward is not about becoming someone new. It is about reclaiming what was always there, hidden behind compliance, buried under trauma, filtered through manipulation, not just for yourself, but for those around you. Because every time you stop pretending, you give someone else permission to do the same. Do not expect applause. Truth is rarely rewarded, and honesty, in a world trained by deception, is often misunderstood. But you are not here for approval anymore. You are here to awaken. And if something inside you shifted while listening, if some belief, some habit, some story you have told yourself started to crack, then share this video with someone who needs to see the same fracture, someone who is living the role, not the reality. Comment what part of yourself you are now ready to question. And subscribe, not because this is content, but because this is a process, a long, unsettling, liberating process. And what comes next will not tell you what to think. It will reveal what others worked so hard to keep hidden. We are not done with the dark secrets yet. There are more. You will feel them. You might even fear them. But once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And that is when change begins.